pay tribute to the memory of a person who had worked relentlessly towards and achieved much in realizing the goals of education, Professor N.K. Jain. With each passing year, we hope to continue making a conscious effort to carry forward the ideals and values that he lived by. We strongly believe that as an institution, we can draw inspiration and guidance from the rich legacy that he has left behind. We are both delighted and honored to have Professor Isabel Hoffma in our midst, and who has so very graciously acceded to our request to deliver the sixth Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am, and welcome. I also welcome late Professor Jain's family, relatives, friends, and colleagues, and acknowledge the presence of some of his students as well in the audience. May I now invite Dr. Ashok Gupta, Honorable Chancellor of the University, for the welcome address. Sir.
Professor Isabel Hoffma, colleagues, and dear students, Namaskar. A warm welcome to you all on the occasion of the 6th Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture being organized by the IIS University. Our university is a cosmopolitan and vibrant institution moving into its third decade of nationwide presence as a leading name in the field of higher education, grooming the next generation of world-ready creative leadership. Today is that time of the year, again, when we come together for this memorial lecture organized to celebrate the life and times of Professor N.K. Jain and find our way back to the benchmark set by an academician who remains to all those who knew him a fine embodiment of a life well lived. To look back to the days when Professor Jain came to be associated with our university is to remember someone who was driven to excel, to nurture, to guide. As Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, he fulfilled those roles to the best of his prodigious abilities. A scholar at heart and teacher by vocation, he led by his own example, showing students and faculty members alike what teaching and learning truly meant. Coming from a strong academic and professional background, he touched many minds with his vast knowledge, exceptional grasp of language and literature, a unique wit and turn of expression, and a wry sense of humor, which his students and colleagues remember to this day. His stepping into a classroom was met with a sense of excitement and expectation, his students knowing that they would have enriched and improved in equal measure. Leading his audience in open discourses, he ably encouraged suggestions and innovations with regard to both teaching and research. His journey inspired all who knew him, as evidenced by those who hold fond memories of the person he was. Well liked and deeply respected by friends, relatives, and colleagues, Professor Jain is also remembered as a steadfast pillar of the IIS family. Over the years, his erudite scholarship laid the groundwork for the friendships and academic connections that have sustained till date. Many of those people, I'm sure, are in the audience today. I'm happy to welcome you all to the 6th Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture, which has been organized at the initiative of the university's Department of English Literature and Language, Professor Jain's parent department, to honor the memory of a dear colleague and revered teacher. I extend a special welcome to Mrs. Mithilesh Jain, late Professor Jain's wife, and most importantly, to Professor Isabel Hoffma, who I cannot thank enough for her gracious consent to deliver the 6th commemorative lecture. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, sir. I'd now like to invite Dr. Ila Joshi, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the university, to formally introduce the eminent speaker for the day, Professor Isabel Hoffma, before inviting her to deliver the memorial lecture on books in the biosphere, print culture, and the Anthropocene. Ma'am.
Thank you, Rimika. Namaskar. It is my proud privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker today. Christine Isabel Hoffmer is a South African academic who specializes in literary studies and literary history. She is a professor emeritus at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, where she became a professor of African literature in 1994. She was also Global Distinguished Professor at New York University, USA from 2013 to 2022. Professor Hofmer is particularly well known for her work in post-colonialism, Gandhian studies on textual circulation, textual transnationalism, the Indian Ocean world, as well as post-colonial history of the book and print culture. Some of our recent publications include Dockside Reading, Hydro-Colonialism and the Custom House, which came out in 2022, and a co-edited special issue on Reading for Water in Interventions, which too was published in 2022. Having listed out her stellar academic and scholarly credentials, I now invite Professor Isabel Hofmer to deliver the 6th Professor N.K. Jain Memorial Lecture on Books in the Biosphere, Print Culture, and the Anthropocene. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And thank you to everybody involved in the organization of this event. It's really an extraordinary honor and delight to be here and to speak in memory of somebody who was a remarkable scholar, educator, and human being. Particularly warm thanks to Rumika Singhvi for your wonderful and unfailing assistance. And as I say, it really is a huge delight. And thank you again for the honor of this invitation. So let me begin with an image. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me begin with this image, which, as you can see, is of a book slowly going moldy and disintegrating. This image is not taken from the internet, but has instead been grown in my Johannesburg garden. The book in question is J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace, which will be well known to colleagues in the English department. And I took this book and I placed it in a shaded portion of my garden and have been watering it regularly. So hence the effect that you see there. And let me just hasten to add that I have huge respect for the novel and am not in any way attempting to bury it. This experiment, if I can just say, is part of a project that I'm currently pursuing called Books in the Biosphere, Print Culture and the Anthropocene. So very briefly, the project is a print culture enterprise that asks how we might think about the dry technology of the book in the coming floods and catastrophes of the Anthropocene. So I'm attempting to take the dry indoor technology of the book outside and immerse it in the elements, both analytically and actually. I'm hence tracking books that end up in water, books that are buried, books that are burned, and so on. I'm also thinking about books in the air and atmosphere. And so I've done work on insects in archives, which I'll tell you about. And this focus on insects has also then led me to plants, and I'll talk a bit about that. So I'm currently pursuing these vegetal themes, both indoors and out, in academic work and creative practice. So as regards the latter, I'm exploring a process variously called eco-printing or botanical printing. And that's those are some of the pieces that I've made. And let me just very briefly, how the process works is you take paper or fabric, which you treat in particular ways. You then roll it up, you place your plant matter on it. You roll it up very tightly and then apply some heat, either boiling or steaming. And the heat then, as you can see here, transfers the character of the leaf onto the substrate. So last year, I showed some of this work in an exhibition called Gasp. And the title Gasp comes from the process itself, because as the leaves really give up their last bit of life or their vital juices, it creates, as you can see there, a little halo or gasp at the stem. So here's another example, and you get that sort of effect. And just here, a few shots from the exhibition itself. This was a work in paper, on paper. And then there's some of, that's the exhibition itself and some of the pieces on fabric. So in broad terms, then, both the academic and creative work is an attempt to bring together book history and environmental humanities. I am by no means the first to do so, and there is now a burgeoning field taking shape at this intersection. Scholars investigate the ecological footprint of book production and the changing nature of preservation and archives in the Anthropocene, where permanent supplies of electricity and air conditioning can no longer be assured. Other themes include printed books becoming waste and entering landfills in the digital age. And these themes, of course, intersect with a growing scholarship on the environmental entanglements of digital media itself. So Joshua Calhoun, who's an early modernist, explores papermaking and the organic nature of the page, asking, and I quote, "How has communication been altered by the corruptibility of the non-human matter used to make texts?" So as he indicates, modern readers and scholars in particular seldom recognize the plants, animals, and minerals in their media, thanks, of course, to chemicals, electricity, and air conditioning that keep documents in a state of suspended decay. So let me pick up then on the theme of plants and animals, both in and as media, and present you with two short case studies. The first will be on plants, and then the second will be on insects in archives. So let's begin then with plants, or more specifically, what is now called the plant humanities or critical plant studies, a rapidly growing area of study stimulated by developments in the plant sciences, which focus on plant sentience, agency, and intelligence. These themes have in turn been taken up by humanities scholars exploring the intersection of environmental humanities, plant sciences, art and aesthetics, philosophy, and ethics. One credo of the field has been to think about plants in material and concrete terms as much as in representational or metaphorical terms. Put differently, we need to think about plant lives rather than just plant life in the abstract. So we must turn our attention to actual rather than just symbolic plants. So let me heed this advice and introduce you to two actual plants or sections of plants. So the first one on the left is housed in an envelope in the State Archives in Cape Town. So the section of plant was collected in the far north of what was to become South Africa in June of 1906 and forwarded for identification to the herbarium in Cape Town. If you're interested, the plant is Lophiocarpus polystachys, or known colloquially in South Africa as a sandalbossie. So our second plant on the right is a pressed specimen of a plant called Commelina africana, and it's currently housed in the National Herbarium in Pretoria. It was collected by Jan Smuts, a name you might know, who was also, in addition to being a prime minister and nemesis of Gandhi, was also an amateur botanist. And he did a lot of botanizing with a woman called Margaret Gillett, and they collected this specimen again in the north of the country in 1936. So these two dried plants have both become archival, but in slightly different ways. The first is a plant in an archive. The second really is plant as archive, in that the plant itself carries information, of interest to botanists who then read the plant in a particular way. My interest in both is to think about plants and print, okay? To try and think then about the texts that are generated around and by plants. And this, is a way of thinking then about plants and book history. So in the first case of the Lophiocarpus polystachys, as you can see, is this little plant is on His Majesty's service. It has been pressed into service and has entered the mills of governance. Tracking the lives of plants through colonial state archives makes us aware of them as governed objects, but also as lenses on that governance. As plants move around the world, and especially across colonial biotic borders, they are accompanied by sheets of documentation. So as the plant moves, it generates any number of texts. And let me just show you, here are just some examples of the kinds of documentation that accompanied plants on the move. You can see, a form for the introduction of plant by post, another certificate for inspection of plants in transit, permits endlessly for the introduction of plants. You can see another certificate of inspection and so on and so on. So there was just endless kind of production of these documents around plants. So these printed documents were used to govern plants in transit, determining where the plant could and couldn't go. Yet the vitality of the plant often outstripped these directives. So seeds germinated, roots sprouted, cuttings decayed, vegetables developed wet rot. And these, of course, exceeded the strictures of these forms, requiring yet new ones to be generated. So the plant itself then stands as an image in miniature of border governance. It's a potentially contaminated object that had to be cleansed at the colonial frontier before entry is permitted. So in this guise, the plant offered a model for how to govern other tricky items. So as I've shown in this book, Dockside Reading, customs officials were the people who scrutinized printed matter entering colonial ports, to check whether the books and so on were subversive in any way. At times, the treatment of plants acted as a model for the censorship work. So the incoming plants were scrutinized by officials called plant inspectors, and they would check the plants, and any diseased specimens would be refused entry. So these protocols then offered customs officials a model for how to conceptualize their work as censors. So the content then of subversive publications is understood as a kind of troublesome substance, rather like a microbial disease, similar to what might lurk in plants. So subversive books then came to be managed as a form of contaminated plant life. So, plants there inform a model of how people think about books. So moving then on to our second example, the Commelina africana, and let me just show you, this is what it looks like in a living form. Part of this, of course, these herbarium specimens and the plant itself would generate huge amounts of botanical writing. It also, Smuts, as an amateur botanist, drew a lot on botanical thinking in his philosophy of holism, which was a kind of colonial ecology, towards establishing a kind of racialized hierarchy. But let me look rather at some lesser known texts generated directly or indirectly by this Commelina africana. So the first of these would be, as you can see, these herbarium sheets are covered in lots of little miniature texts. And just briefly, the herbarium sheet, of course, is a key technology of imperial botany. It's akin to the botanical illustration that extracted the plant from its environment, made it portable, and entered it into the Linnaean system of classification. So this question of portability, of course, in an imperial domain was important, especially before little glazed plant boxes made sea transport of live plants possible. So living plants are apparently quite difficult to transport by sea. Okay, there are other dimensions to explore. And you can see these herbarium sheets bring us closer to particular botanical lives, the lives of these actual plants, telling us where they were collected, when they were collected, and by whom they were collected. You can see these little plants then have generated these miniature texts. You can see lots of labels. You can see stamps, handwritten notes, one there on the top left, notes, tags, stickers. If you can see the image in the middle in the top left, in fact, has a little map. The name of the collector appears, and then more recently, the name and initial of the person who actually mounted these pressed specimens appears, and all of this often in many different languages. So these accompanying notes on the specimen would indicate, you know, where the plant, the locality of the plant, the habitat in which it was found. And so they're actually really quite beautiful. A lot of them are like very short little lyric poems. And I've just extracted a few of these little phrases and strung them together. And as you can see, it makes quite a sweet little charming poem, which you can read. So Commelina africana then is this, as I said, this perennial spreading herb. And it's widely recognized for its medicinal properties. And so one of its further textual lives has been in the form of newspaper advertisements and pamphlets for herbal remedies. So one example comes from a famed person here, Mafavuke Ngcobo. Okay, now we don't actually have a photograph of him, but this is a filmic reconstruction. And he was a very famous kind of, traditional herbalist. And he ran a very large mail order company from Durban in the 1920s and the 1930s. So he had this mail order empire of herbal medicines. There's a historian, Corin Flint, who's discussed him and showed, in fact, that how he was subsequently really squeezed out by white pharmacists in Durban, who themselves wanted to monopolize this huge market amongst both Africans and Europeans for herbal medicines. And they also wanted to seek to prevent African practitioners from using biomedical procedures, which they wanted to define as white, use of stethoscopes, allopathic medicines, and so on. So here, this is a pamphlet from, as you can see, from Mafavuke Ngcobo. And the really interesting thing here is you can see his little logo is in Zulu is Idangabane, which is Commelina africana. So he's chosen Commelina africana as his sort of icon. And it's not difficult to see why he made this choice. The species is extremely tenacious and ruderal. It's a botanical term used to describe plants that can establish themselves very quickly on disturbed ground. So given the colonial context in which he worked and the disturbances and upheavals he faced, this choice obviously made sense. So this, this pamphlet advertised then a range of his remedies, and it's as you can see, it is itself rather like a little textual apothecary with all of these items lined up. And the pamphlet, of course, would have formed part of a therapeutic chain, okay? So this would have included dreams, ancestral messages, plants, ochres, animal products, and then really importantly, the patient and the healer. So the medicine did not work alone, but was a member of a team distributed across a number of agents, including the pamphlet, as we can see, which plays its small part in this assemblage of healing. So as such, the pamphlet, these kinds of pamphlets really constitute a mobile and dynamic Southern African literary form, in part, as we can see, generated by the character of the plant itself, as I say, like Commelina africana, which has generated, in a sense, this icon and this part of this pamphlet. Okay, so let's leave plants then for the moment and turn to our second case study, which is insects in archives. And we open our story in the Cape colonial archives round about 1910. Okay. So the in tray of the government entomologist not infrequently resembled an insectarium. Exasperated gardeners and worried householders posted bugs, dead and alive, in envelopes, tins, matchboxes, and bottles, seeking remedies for their ruined carnations and worm-eaten floors. One morning in February 1910 in Cape Town, 2 flasks of insects arrived, dispatched by the Attorney General's office, where they had been discovered in the records of the Registrar of Deeds. The state entomologist, Charles Lounsbury, was quick to recognize the creatures as the paste beetle, okay, or then called Cytodrepa panaceum, today Stegobium panaceum. So, and he writes, quote, their ravages in stored volumes of records were well known, and he says, have been the theme of many memoranda from this office during the past 14 years. So over those 14 years, an array of arthropods in both their larval and adult forms had taken up residence in the collections of government documents and the shelves that housed them. So these included furniture beetles, biscuit beetles, paste beetles, fish moths, cockroaches, white ants, book lice, and weevils, known collectively and misleadingly as bookworms. These creatures had in turn been assailed by a range of chemicals in powder, aerosol, liquid, and gaseous form: corrosive sublimate, carbon bisulfate, sulfuric acid, methyl bromide, cyanide of potassium, hydrocyanic acid, paraffin oil, naphthalene, and so on. So these fumigation spraying and sprinklings had met with mixed success, and reports of insects, plus the insects themselves, continued to make their way to the in-tray of the government entomologist. While miniature in scale, this intersection of insect, paper, and chemicals has prompted scholars to explore larger themes. Through following the trail of white ants, Rohan Deb Roy has discussed the entomopolitics of the imperial state. Other researchers have traced the chemical legacies in museum and archival collections and their implication for the restitution of objects. Related themes include the imperial formation of entomology, largely shaped in the tropics, and the intertwined histories of war, insecticide, and genocide. Print culture and book history suggest further productive angles, especially as regards the ecology of texts. Can we, as Calhoun urges us, recognize the plants, animals, and minerals in our media? So the case of the paste beetle then draws attention to the non-human matter in texts and processes of decay. So leather and cloth binding, starch paste, animal glues, cellulose-based paper and cardboard and mold all offered opportunities for larval and in some cases adult feeding of what were known as stack pests. Archivists had to scrutinize their volumes, attending to different kinds of bindings and paper, with a report from the Antilles and Calcutta indicating that, quote, and I quote, the cosmopolitan book maggot favored red bindings and chose French paper over English. So these latter discussions cohered under the rubric of, quote, books in the tropics, where enemies of the codex were deemed to be plentiful. As self-appointed custodian of the book, the colonial state was ever keen to defend its volumes against such enemies. In 1920, the government printers of Uganda produced an official handbook which carried a slip indicating that the solution used for binding would, quote, render the work impervious to the ravages of insects. So while the insect community in any archive was varied, one would always be assured of finding members of the family Anobidae or borers. And these, of course, went by a range of colloquial names. As we've seen, they're known by different names in different parts of the world. There was the biscuit beetle, the drugstore beetle, the tobacco beetle, the bread beetle, and in the Cape archives, the paste beetle. So as these names suggest, these few food opportunists have been inhabiting human provisions for millennia, and today are generally discussed under the category of stored product insects. So following this logic, we might refer to them as stored book insects, a niche they have been occupying ever since codexes, manuscripts, books, and paper have been around. So stored books often obviously an ideal habitat for borers. There's a concentration of cellulose and protein in a dark, quiet, and in some instances, temperature-controlled environment, largely free of predators. Most bookworms probably arrived through already inhabited volumes, although some must have located their own bibliohabitats using skills of semiochemical detection and color recognition, possibly explaining the often noted popularity of red bindings. So just adult females would deposit eggs on or in the volume, and these paper-eating larvae will then burrow minute tunnels into the volume, producing that tiny, shot hole effect that one often encounters in old books. So under ideal temperature and humidity conditions, the larvae would spend 1 or 2 months in their books before pupating, after which the adults emerge. And with a lifespan of 2 to 3 weeks, the adults fly onto the next suitable volume before eggs are again oviposited. So as Emma Solberg in her wonderful article, Human and Insect Bookworms indicates, bibliovores often treat books like habitats, sort of akin to a log, so they burrow on the outer perimeter. She says, conveniently for us, bookworms prefer the exterior and the edges of books to the interior or the center. They tend to make their tunnels, holes, and burrows in the covers, gutters, and margins. Yet, in treating books like plants, insects must have considered them as rather sad specimens of vegetation, unable to produce any of their own defenses. Most plants and trees have a range of protective mechanisms against herbivorous insects, or at least those with which they have co-evolved. These include, alarm chemicals that alert other plants to danger or attract predators, compounds which disrupt insect metabolism, mechanical adaptations like closing on touch, which displaces the insect, and resin to force out borers. Without any of these, books must have resembled failed plants, a concentration of cellulose unable to defend itself in any way. So this physical presence of insects was not the only mode in which insects occupied archives. Many of the files of the entomology department are arranged around particular species so that the insect itself shapes bureaucratic categories. You also get very often drawings in the files, as well as insects, as well as photographs. So, and also, many of the prophylactic strategies are very strong smelling, naphthalene, creosote, shellac, and that smell would have reminded users and archivists of the presence of insects, as would have the closure of archives for fumigation. So let's talk a bit about then fumigation in the Cape archives. Arrived at more or less the same time as its use in 2 other locales, firstly orchards and vineyards, and secondly Cape Town Harbour. So like pesticides in many parts of the world, those on the fruit trees and vines of the Western Cape were the product of a US expertise and experiment. Leading the local charge was Charles Lounsbury, the first government entomologist appointed in 1895. He was then a 23-year-old fresh out of Amherst Agricultural College. So like his mentors, Lounsbury was a great proponent of pesticide, seeing them as a necessary technology that could make farming in South Africa modern. The second site, Cape Town Harbour, like most imperial ports, had been carrying out sulfuric fumigation of ships since the 1880s, and in 1895 extended fumigation to the dockside, adding a plant fumigator, and in 1901 a steam disinfector. So as with many life forms in the Cape Colony, the fate of the insects in the archives was shaped by capitalist agriculture on the one hand and colonial maritime border making on the other. There are, of course, myriad other factors one could list, but for the moment, let's stick with these 2, since it was the State Departments associated with them which advised the archives on how to address their insect problem. So the first and most frequently called upon was the entomological division. The second was the immigration department, which along with the port health authorities oversaw fumigation. So the ways then in which insects encountered chemicals in the archives were offshoots of the fumigation practices and protocols of these two divisions. So Loonsbury's department defines its mission as economic entomology, with a major focus on, quote, injurious insects that affected those plants and crops of interest to humans. The recommendations that entomologists made to archivists were informed by their experience of dealing with insect infestations in plants and stored goods. So they brought the logic of, dealing with plants to the archive. So in proposing the use of methyl bromide in archives, a report, probably from the 1920s, spoke only of its effectiveness in relation to eradicating insects on plants and not, archival settings. So after noting the chemical's, quote, property of penetration, which make possible the destruction of certain sheltered pests, such as leaf miners, borers, mites, and other internal feeders, the report praises the ability of methyl bromide to disinfect quarantine products and plants, whether imported Christmas trees, narcissus bulbs, green coffee beans, or dehydrated soup. So for entomologists, the archives then were subsumed, as I say, into the logic of insect control in plants. Archives were implicitly a kind of species of herbarium, their documents and volumes like so many closely packed leaves. So whereas the entomologists saw the archives as a type of monocrop in need of pesticide, the immigration department approached the problem from a framework of contaminated ships and cargo. From this perspective, the insects may have seemed like miniature rats running riot, the volumes like infested blankets or secondhand clothing in need of disinfection. So schooled in maritime fumigation, immigration officers were wedded to sulfuric forms of disinfection for ships, and steam disinfection for cargo and luggage. And when all else fails, they would consign things to what was called the destructor, the furnace. These techniques, of course, did not map at all onto the archives. And when consulted for advice, immigration officials really were at a loss and tended to consult like the Public Works Department or indeed other archivists. So this ham-handedness of the immigration department was further augmented by international shifts in fumigation technologies. So since the 1880s, maritime fumigation techniques had been sulfur-based, but from the 1900s, cyanide-based methods gained the upper hand. So first used in the Californian citrus industry in the 1880s, these latter systems involved derivatives of hydrocyanic gas, and they were in South Africa, actively promoted by Loonsbury, the government entomologist. As these methods took hold, a variety of commercial applications of hydrocyanic gas as a pesticide were developed, most notoriously Zyklon B, which was to become the genocidal instrument of the Nazi regime. So patented in 1923, this compound was actively marketed as a pesticide in several regions of the world, including South Africa, where it was used until the 1950s as an insecticide. So here are just some pamphlets advertising, as you can see, Zyklon B. And this is from one of those pamphlets produced in Durban. And just interestingly, you can see the danger symbols are set out in English, Afrikaans, Zulu, and Tamil. Okay, so let me move now towards some general conclusions. What larger issues arise from relocating book and print mediums amongst other media, in this case, insect and plant media? As we've seen, insects play a role in producing unusual definitions of the book. We've seen insects and entomologists almost shared an understanding of books and printed matter as failed plants. For insects, they were unable to protect themselves, and for the entomologists, They had to be saved by the chemical formulas of the entomology department. So the work of this insect in books raises further questions about reading texts and archive itself. So Emma Solberg, who I've mentioned, raises this question of reading. She says, wormholes have been understood as damage, as that which gets in the way of reading, not as something to be read. She suggests including wormholes as part of the text, positioning insects as co-writers and readers with humans. It's a really interesting and suggestive idea, yet one can't help wondering whether this rather benign view arises from the excellent preservation conditions of wealthy libraries and archives in the global north, where superb storage conditions, permanent electricity, and plentiful resources enable damage to be kept to a minimum. As we all know, these are not conditions prevailing in archives of the global south. How then can one read post-colonial wormholes, assuming, of course, that one can even get access to the document in the first place? In part, of course, this question forms part of a long-standing colonial debate on reading in and for damage, and in turn, a whole set of considerations of almost the aesthetics of unmaking. So one route, I think, into this takes us onto plants and the idea of the ruderal, namely a plant able to grow on waste or disturbed ground or rubbish. So the plant that Norbo adopted in his pamphlet, Commelina, as we see in Commelina africana, is a ruderal plant. And just as a footnote, this Commelina, this is a species that you get around the Indian Ocean, and it's closely related to this Commelina bengalensis, apparently the Bengal, if I understand it correctly, popularly known as the Bengal dayflower. And it's also a very hardy ruderal. So Commelina africana, or Idangabane in Zulu, offered metaphorical and material resources for Norbo's project. So as we've seen, the plant, the person, and the printed pamphlet taking root in disturbed and adverse circumstances. So in this instance, there is a transposition between the potentialities of plant media, the person, and print. So this talk has drawn together insects, plants, and prints as intersecting forms of media that can resituate the existing conceptualizations of the book as a purely textual and indoor object. So to return to Calhoun, there is good reason to pay very close attention to the plants, animals, and minerals in our media. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, ma'am. This was indeed fluently delivered and has made so much sense that I think some of us will take a couple of minutes and observe silence to process and take it all in. But of course, let me attempt a very poor, summary of sorts before we open it up for questions, comments, queries, etc. So thank you so much, ma'am, for such an intellectually stimulating lecture. It has indeed opened up the discourse of and on how just as disciplines across the humanities and social sciences, are grappling with, the kind of changes that we're seeing around us. Studies of print media as well as book history also are looking at the kind of monumental, significant challenges, posed by the Anthropocene. And the way in which you have thematically relocated print culture by building on your recent book, Dockside Reading, also in a kind of ecosystem of plants, animals, mineral, water, air, everything, soil, I think all that is in the biosphere, so to speak, which is also the term in your title. It has indeed paved the way for more, research, further exploration of such themes, especially as the ones that you have already identified for us and, opened up, books in the elements, insects and colonial archives, and plant politics in print. I think these are the three most vital takeaways in terms of, how young researchers and also, all of us can look at future scholarship in areas which sort of go beyond books for, scholarship in a non-textual, I mean, looking at, maybe the insect as text, henceforth. So thank you very much for this, ma'am. Time now for inviting comments and queries. I request you all to either type those out in the chat box. Better would be to just, raise your hand, wait for your name to be called out, because we respect turn taking immensely. So if we could do that, you could raise your hand, and hopefully I will be able to, along with my colleagues in the department, will be able to spot you, and then we can one by one ask our questions. For those who are unable to turn on the camera, of course, can type out their queries, and we'll try to take those to Professor Hoffman. So the floor is open.
Could I just add in the meanwhile, while people think up their comments?
Sure.
I'm sure you would be familiar with Sumana Roy's work, and she's been a really major introducing plant humanities.
Right. Yes.
At Ashoka, and she's also,
That's right. Yeah.
Done this a book called Plant Theory.
Sure.
I haven't had a chance to read, but she's doing really fantastically interesting work.
Absolutely. In fact, she was on our list for probably inviting over for, sometimes we have these also face-to-face interactions as, as part of our enrichment lecture series. So when your topic came in, we did think that, it could align very well with her area of expertise. And maybe going forward, we could look at, the Indian sort of, terrain, literally, and also in terms of, what's happening over here in terms of scholarship and research. But thank you so much. We do have her details, but now that you sort of endorse her as somebody who, has something to say as well, we'll made a note.
And she's got this absolutely fantastic book called How I Became a Tree.
Right. Okay. I see. Is that it? Okay. Noted, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I would request my colleagues, and those are my colleagues, ma'am. For those of you, the blue tidal wave is all us. These are all the Department of English faculty members. So assuming we get some time to ourselves, we'll of course come in. But I think right of way should be given to scholars, students, and of course invited guests. So Dr. Purabi and Ms. Nishtha, Dr. Garima, Dr. Smita, if you see any comment in the chat box, could you take it up, or any raised hand? I see something from Swapnil. She thanks you for an interesting and informative lecture, Professor Hoffman. Jyoti Pava also says she conveys her thanks for such an insightful talk. Chanda Asani also writes, she's a former colleague. She was with us in the Department of Women's Studies here, as she introduces herself in the chat box, and admittedly a fan of late Professor Jain's. Do we have a raised hand? Smita, do you see a raised hand? Am I missing someone?
Yes, ma'am. There's just one comment, but there's no raised hand as of now.
Okay, no raised hand. I think we've looked at the comments. So I think while they're processing, would you want to, Dr. Garima, Dr. Purabi, anyone? Or I do see Professor Sudhar Rai and some of our teachers here, right here with Jain sir's colleagues. Sudha ma'am, are you here? Would you want to come in? Maybe just to also say hello to Professor Hoffman. There's Venkat sir. I also saw, I think I saw Dr. Neeta Kothari.
I'm also really just interested to hear if there are people who are thinking about plants in their own work, so is it in whatever form it comes up? This plant humanities, I think, is a really interesting area that I'm also trying really to, I'm also quite new in the area, so I'd be really just interested to hear if people have any thoughts on questions of.
Yes, I hope there would be some who show interest. I think there'll be more who probably are working in the area of oceanic studies, blue humanities, and perhaps print culture. I mean, I'm hoping that there'll be somebody from, the print culture side of it to engage with you. But meanwhile, I was also looking at Professor Jain's colleagues back in the day when he taught at the University of Rajasthan, because I do have a couple of big names in the list of attendees. I'm thinking if I can just go over to them and then have the students come in meanwhile. I do see a couple of others. I did see there's Dr. Rima Huja. Rima ma'am, would you want to come in briefly and engage with Professor Hoffmeyer? I see Dr. Preeti Chaudhary, Dr. Rati Oberoi, and of course, then my colleagues in the department. There's also Dr. Sanjay Kumar. I was wondering if anyone.
So, hello, this is Rima, and being
Welcome.
mildly technologically challenged, I've just taken some time to unmute myself. So, I've just noticed this question about Indian plants, and there's always been a long theme in history, in mythology, about people who could understand what wildlife was saying, but also the language of plants. But offhand, I can't think of too many documents. We have traditional documents that deal with it. It's not really my expertise, but there is one relating to a particular time period of Indian history, close enough to our times, 16th century, where there is a battle. In fact, it's a very famous battle that is taught to Indian school children and college and everything. In Mewar, the Battle of Haldighati. I'm not going into the main things except that to say that it is an emperor against a smaller regional state. What's relevant for plants is that that is a time period when a text is penned. And you would think war is the last time, or not the best of times to think about what you're going to be planting in times of peace. But that is a manuscript that deals with how to graft things, how to grow cotton, how to understand what nature is saying to you, how to tap sources for water. And so my then question comes more to, across the globe, are there oral traditions and written traditions that we should start paying more attention to than we have done, through our more traditional way of looking at knowledge and knowledge systems? And that makes sense the way I asked it.
Okay, great, fantastic, thank you. I mean, I think I think it's a really central question, because it's also this question of how do you sort of, a lot of is how do you untrain yourself from one thing in order to see something that you've never really been able to see. So a lot of the plant humanities is interested in how is plant blindness cultivated, how we train sort of not to see plants, or to see plants in very abstract terms or in sort of collective neutral terms that make sense to humans, like forest or garden or whatever the case may be. So I think really the oral traditions are really, really fantastic, because I think you very often get very interesting forms of plant protagonists in those stories. And again, that really makes you think about what does it mean to have a plant protagonist without simply thinking about the plant as a kind of miniature human. And what is so once you think about plants and you center plants and you think about, what does it do for the way that you read texts? So I think, I think that's a really interesting thing. And there's quite a lot of interesting, literary work happening with people trying to grapple with this question. A book that I found really useful is Novel Cultivations by Elizabeth Hope Chang, which looks at the kind of 19th century global novel through plants. And does really, it provides really interesting rereadings. The one that struck me is that there's a very well-known 19th century South African novel called The Story of an African Farm by Olive Schreiner. And she rereads that text looking very closely, particularly at the prickly pear, so taking one species and thinking about what does that mean for the whole, the way that we read or interpret that novel. So I think it is, and of course it is the earlier example that you used about the text that talks about how, advice on how to graft and how to grow cotton and how to tap water. I think those are also really interesting because those are, radically different. Well, not, but those are sort of very different ways of categorizing and thinking about plants as opposed to, like the Linnaean system into which all plants have now been absorbed.
Well, thank you for that. But if I'm allowed a second question, and that's something that's been fascinating me and I don't know who to ask about. Sorry, I've just discovered my eyeglasses, my spectacles, which were on me all the time. I was recently in Malaysia on the island of Borneo and doing something connected with archaeology, which is what my PhD is in. And it struck me that a lot of the plants on the island of Borneo, which is south of the Wallace Line, are things that humans need to, not animals. Humans need to pre-treat in order to remove their poison. Or there are other plants that have a lot of seeds in them, but they have a lot of prickles on the outside. So the equivalent of whether it is rambutans or breadfruit or ways in which tapioca, manioc, all of those, it's almost like plant life is saying, like wildlife would. Wildlife has claws to defend themselves. A plant life is saying to humans that we exist, we are not just there as your food. I don't really know where to take that forward. So would you like to comment on something like this of, how plants are protecting themselves as much as we humans are impinging on them?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it is, as you say, the thinking about the human-plant interaction. And as you say, the plants on the one hand need to defend themselves, but then the other argument is that plants use humans. So Amitav Ghosh was recently in Johannesburg and giving lectures, but also spoke about, his book on the opium trade, Smoke and Ashes. And the point that he makes is that this poppy, the opium poppy is an extremely clever species, which uses, the British Empire to get itself spread all over. And it uses the sort of deep, dark human desires and, kind of addictive propensities to spread itself. So, it's plants, the argument he's making is also, I in fact had to be the interlocutor for that Smoke and Ashes session. And I said to him at the end, perhaps one measure of the cleverness of the poppy is that it chose you to write about it. So, yeah, but I think, as you say, it is both ways. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff now thinking about that also, that in a sense, plants also have been able to spread themselves by plugging into, human desires, whether it's for addiction or beauty or whatever the case may be.
Thank you. Thank you for answering both those questions so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Huja, I think, for opening it up, because now I can see a barrage of comments also in the chat box, and I'm quite excited for it to be even more interactive. So thank you for opening it up even more with your questions. There is a question from Dr. Rati Oberoi. She wants to ask about what literature is available on Indian plants. So I think probably we could also refer her to, like you did to us, the book by Professor Sumana Rai. Maybe she does take that up in a big way in her book. Next, quickly, because this is a long one, Yagiseni is one of our students from the department. Shafali, I know you raised your hand. Just give me a minute, because I'll quickly go through 2-3 of these comments, and then you come right in. So Yagiseni, of course, talks about the fascinating lecture, and she says, as a student of history, I especially found the section on colonial archive cataloging, the natural environment very interesting. As part of my own research, I have come across early Portuguese travelers noting keenly about the natural environment, early interventions to understand a new land and how they themselves were getting transformed by the geography around them. So I think that's an observation from a student of history. And I think the fact that Professor Huja from archaeology, also history, brought this whole aspect of, the interactionism, I think is pretty lovely. So that's, I think, an observation there. And now I hand it over to Shefali Martins, again, an ex-student from the department and currently a research scholar who's working with me. So Shefali, please take it away.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I would firstly also like to thank you on behalf of Dr. Jain's family, because I happen to be a close family friend and I used to live with him when I studied at IIS, then ICG. This takes me back to a master's class with him when he taught us John Donne. And I was thinking of the flea. And I know somewhere, wherever in the universe he is, he would be smiling at this whole perspective that you have brought
The
to us
analogy.
today.
Hmm.
And yes, and I just took it back there. And we also come from a culture where we put pressed flowers in books. From now, I'm going to look at them very differently and also going to allow them to be part of text, as you said. I picked up something from what you said in the end, how insects are co-writers and readers. I think that is a very, very interesting perspective that we need to now look at when we look at the idea of the book as a living text in every way, not just metaphorically. And also, I thought the aesthetics of unmaking was a very beautiful expression that you brought forth, because usually we link aesthetics with a lot of making. But the unmaking bit was really, really interesting. I think, ma'am, I would have to listen and re-listen to this lecture over and over again to gather more from it. But I'd really, really like to thank you personally, and also from on behalf of the family of Dr. Jain, for this wonderful, wonderful perspective that you've brought to us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Shall I respond to those two? To Yagaseni's, thank you for that. Really, it's a very fascinating thing as these, sort of European travelers, soldiers, whatever, went out into new environments. And there is, of course, this huge, this figure of the plant hunter, which these people would go all over the world collecting often thousands of specimens and taking them back to Europe, and beginning at this massive, it was something that was obviously already in motion, but this massive plant transfer across various parts of the world. And I think the really fascinating point that's often made is that you're getting various, officials, soldiers, whoever from Europe, which has a very limited, at that stage, very limited biodiversity, going into environments where they're simply overwhelmed by they cannot believe that there are so many different species. And that itself becomes really interesting, because botany becomes, in some senses, an amateur pursuit. So it was one way in which a lot of women could become involved. So it had some, at the edges of botany, people could become involved. So in South Africa, for example, in the Cape Floral Kingdom, which is extraordinarily diverse, there were a lot of amateur botanists who kept writing to Kew Gardens saying, I found a new species. And the people at Kew Gardens said, oh, these amateur botanists are so stupid. What do they think? There can't be all these new species. But in fact, it was the case, because the biodiversity was so rich. But of course, today, if you look at herbariums, there's this extraordinary biodiversity in the herbariums of the North. And I had an opportunity, in fact, to go and do a bit of research in the Kew Herbarium, which is the most really interesting and extraordinary place. But you've had this thing. So in those herbariums, often of the global North, you have these sort of monuments to these species that are now extinct. So the whole, it's a sort of interesting story about the ongoing sort of afterlives of sort of imperial inequality, sort of intellectual inequality. Shefali, thank you so much for your fabulous example of the flea. I hadn't actually thought of it, but it's such an interesting thing to try and really, really sort of think about what sort of flea, which species of flea could that have been? What can we know about that actual flea? And this is a really delightful example. And the pressed flowers also was very much part, almost as an offshoot part. It's a much older tradition, but it's also links into this amateur botany. So many people would keep pressed flowers, and then there was a lot of people then built up their own little herbariums, making these sheets with pressed flowers as a sort of quasi-scientific. And they're extraordinary. I mean, I can't, it was a very, very, very common pastime. So anybody from like Rosa Luxemburg to Paul Klee, the artist, I'm trying to think, Thoreau in the US, in the 19th century, it was Emily Dickinson. And in fact, her very beautiful herbarium is online. And, so it was a very, 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 very common pursuit. Yeah, and just the aesthetics of unmaking, I think, is a really interesting thing, because I suppose it's how do you read post-colonial texts, which.
Thank you, Yagiseni, for writing that long comment out, because it does help and gets the conversation to other directions. And of course, Shefali for asking it almost in person as much as the virtual space allows us. And yes, you do represent his family, so thank you very much in your being here year after year. It's the 6th year. Of course, you meet us on occasions beyond this one, but your presence here, makes a lot of difference, a huge difference to me personally and to the department and the university, because all of us know here, how far back you go with regard to the relationship. So thank you very much. Really lovely to have you over as always. There are 2 more comments, Professor Isabel. There's one from Utkarsh Seni. I believe he is a research scholar at the Aligarh Muslim University, one of the better universities in India. And this young fellow wants to apparently bring in digital literature, and says that with the coming in of it and also artificial intelligence, what are your thoughts on the implications of it on print cultures? I think that war.
Okay, thank you so much. It's not an area that I know.
Yes, because he also says that if it's only pertinent to what you have spoken about.
I can certainly tell you what I think. I mean, but I really,
Sure.
not an area that I really work on. But I think the really interesting question is this thing of, that it's about this sort of interaction of different forms of media. And very often, you get a slightly alarmist reading that new media are going to wipe out old media. Television was going to just destroy cinema. Printed literature was going to destroy oral literature. And of course, what happens actually is that all of them just find a niche. Obviously, they might be reduced in particular sorts of ways, but that is the view that I take, rather than this sort of, catastrophist, here comes this new monster that's going to sort of consume everything. So, and I would rather see that print it will find these different technologies will interact and influence each other in various sorts of ways. If I can just add as a footnote on that, I think from the plant perspective, the really interesting thing, of course, is the digitization of herbarium specimens. So that is actually one really interesting thing, that you can now sort of get access in a way that you couldn't previously to see and look at specimens. But also, of course, I think a lot of digitization of herbariums is also then ultimately to try and get rid of staff and save money. And then they can say, oh, well, it's available to everybody. We no longer need all these botanists and curators. So I think, it cuts both ways.
Right. Utkarsh, I hope that does answer your, question with regard to, the interactions and, how each, I think, how each knowledge domain sort of plays out. And occupies a niche segment without maybe even overlapping. Sometimes I think those overlaps are also good because they force us to go in directions, like you mentioned in the beginning, hitherto unknown, and we've not really looked at something which is right, in front of us in terms of meaning making. So thank you for that. There's another one by Dr. Anita Kothari again. In fact, she happens to be, if I remember correctly, Professor N.K. Jain's one of the first few research scholars, if I'm not mistaken. So Dr. Anita compliments you on the very intriguing lecture, quite an eye-opener topic for me. As a lover of plants, I'm fascinated that plants, insects, soil, etc., can be linked to serious study in literature. So I think, yeah, that's probably all, in
I can
terms of
just
the absolute final takeaway. Yes, sorry, ma'am.
just quickly comment on that. I think, there's
Sure.
really fascinating work now in this, broadly referred to as environmental humanities, which then has sort of subsections, plant humanities, oceanic humanities, and so forth and so on. But I think it's a really fascinating question of what method you use. So if you think, okay, now I'm going to think about water, and maybe I could just talk a bit about that. Myself and two colleagues did this special issue called Reading for Water. And what we did was we got colleagues who work on South African literature to choose any novel they liked, a South African novel, and go back and read it minutely, carefully for water. To then say what new readings did that produce. And of course, it's really fascinating because what started to emerge from that is, for example, how the sense of region, for example, could be defined by the watershed of a river rather than, some other human, how much of a lot of South African literature is very much defined by the coastline. A very famous example, of course, is the monsoon in the Indian Ocean, which, of course, and a lot of narrative takes shape around that. So I think it's a really, and if you're interested in this, you could look at that Reading for Water piece, which I think offers sort of methodological advice, which you could use both for water, but also I think it's a kind of toolbox that you could then carry over into other areas like plants or soil even.
Absolutely, ma'am. I think the methods and then going forward, the methodology increasingly is going to probably go through a sea change, if I may use the pun on the word. And let's see going forward how scholarship opens up and the new frontiers, that present themselves to us. Meanwhile, I'd also like to welcome Professor N.D. Mathur in the audience. Thank you, sir, for joining in. Any comments, queries, sir? I'm not sure how much of the talk were you able to catch, but even if the title catches your interest or anything that you wish to engage with Professor Hoffman and Professor Mathur, any comments, queries, or you did mention that you'd be joining in as and when you can, so I'm thankful to you for making the time. Could you also unmute your mic, sir? I'm afraid you're muted. Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
But I joined very late. That's why I'm not able to make queries.
Sure, sir. Right. Sure, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your presence. Of course, we will be sharing the recording if that's okay with you, Professor Hoffman. Do we have your permission? Because we did record it, and we thought that the university is as part of, the archival capital that we all like to preserve. Anyone else? Any raised hands? Any queries in the chat box? I don't see any new comments. Anybody would like to come in at this point in time? Research scholars, students from other universities, our own from the department, any of our guests. Professor Debarati, who's joined us from Kolkata. Anything from your end, Debarati? Thanks for joining in, for making the time. You've been here all through. I did see you come in at just the right time. So any queries, questions for Professor Isabel? There you are.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking of Dr. Jagadish Chandra Bose, one of the pioneers in the entire world, because he was the first person, I believe, to scientifically prove that plants are sentient. He conducted research and experiments in front of luminaries in his own field. He was a physicist as well as a plant uh, uh, theorist, so to say. And I was just remembering him and thinking of the colonized India, in which he had to work under tremendous pressure in order. I mean, he didn't have any money, didn't have any support, so to say, from the British government. But in spite of that, he managed to do such things. And we are all grateful to him for doing such research. And I think that is one of the starting points when we started looking at the way in which human beings can relate to plants. So I was all along thanking you at the bottom of your mind, of my mind, and at the same time I was thinking of how this could be related to you. Talked about the plants which had their origin in Bengal, and that reminded me of Jagadish Chandra Basu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this, as I said, this recent book by Sumana Roy called Plant Theory looks a lot at Bose's work, and which is, as with this whole move towards thinking about plant sentience, you know, his name is very much, as you say, absolutely re-emerging as an absolute pioneer in this field.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Debarati. Yeah. Professor Debarati is at, if I'm not mistaken, Jadavpur, Debarati. I'm always confused between Jadavpur and Vishwabharati.
I'm
I think
Vishwabharati from Vishwabharati,
See,
Tagore's place.
I
Yes.
knew it. I knew it. So she's, of course, from the university founded by Tagore. So we have representation. I'm very happy. It's pretty pan-India in terms of the representation in terms of attendance. So thank you, Debarati, for that, for bringing in that aspect of Indian scholarship, and from somebody who is not really sort of trained from the literary studies / even interdisciplinary for that matter. This is pretty cross-disciplinary.
Actually, I thought of Jagadish Chandra Bose specially because he was not just a scientist. He wrote stories and
Right.
essays, and he
Yes,
was a great friend of Tagore himself, and
exactly.
he won literary prizes as well.
Absolutely. So see, I think, I don't know, I think we're also probably in an age where we are starting to realize that a great scientist is actually a very creative maverick at heart. So I guess the marriage, has remained and is a good one, science and literature. So I guess that probably should be kept up. Is there anyone else? Oh, there's, oh wow, that's quite a long comment by, again, one of our former students, Mrityunjaya. I'll quickly read that out. Meanwhile, someone called Guru Murthy thanks you for your talk. So Mrityunjaya, here goes. So this is her comment. This was a wonderful lecture indeed, ma'am. It reminds me of how the environment also plays a major role in building memory, both in the past and present, and could be a key aspect to look at in context of memory studies in a way. An example from Indian literature being Toru Dutt's Our Casuarina Tree. So again, one of the first women poets to be writing in English and then bringing in memory and the whole sort of romanticizing of nature, and then the whole subjective aspect, and then how we address, or how do such poems speak to us in this day and age. Thank you for this comment, Mrityunjaya. Would you like to respond to this one, ma'am?
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to immediately going to go and try and find a copy of this casuarina tree. I've come across the casuarina tree in this eco printing that I was telling you about at the beginning. It's very, it's got, if you look at it, it's the needles of the casuarina tree. It's got little segments, so it prints really beautifully with a sort of stippled line. So I would love to, having worked actually with a casuarina tree on this printing process, I'd absolutely love to read this collection. Just on this thing about plants and memory, which of course, they're utterly central. I was listening to a lovely lecture. It was the Shatadru Sen Memorial Lecture by Sunil Amrith, who you probably, you know, if you follow any ecological stuff, he's this major environmental historian at Yale. And he was born in Singapore, and he was talking about a particular banyan tree in the Singapore Botanical Gardens. And it was just a lovely thing about how for him, you know, the memories associated with that. He spoke as well about the, you know, the banyan tree as a particular species. He'd interviewed people in the herbarium attached to the botanical gardens about their many, many, many different memories about this tree. And they are, I mean, trees often have that kind of, you know, almost like archival, monumental function of, you know, carrying, you know, and because very often their lifespans are much longer than humans, they also carry extraordinary amounts, as you say, of historical memory.
Absolutely. I think that was a wonderful insight brought into this discussion with Injil. Happy that you contributed in a big way. In fact, it also makes me realize perhaps the cartographic significance of how we can look at the biosphere, you know, as a bit of a map. You know, how do we look at you know, the various aspects of it as those little points on the map, and you know, how you trace, like the whole idea of tracing and leaving an imprint, you know, both in terms of the trace, which in this case, in Mrityunjay's query, it comes up as memory. Perfect. Is there anyone else? I do see some more cameras being turned on. So there's Dr. Gunja Patni, former scholar of mine. Gunja, would you like to come in at this point? Because we are now drawing to end of the talk session, but if you have a query, comment, or even a compliment.
For sure. Namaskar, ma'am. Thank you so much, first of all, to the IIS University for bringing in such a great scholar and philosopher to us. Isabel, ma'am, we are greatly thankful. And listening to you has really opened up many areas on which we are working. And I'm truly indebted to Professor Singhvi for inviting us here. Your lecture is really, really very insightful. And thank you so much. We'll be taking forward this research and maybe coming across with some more things in future on it. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And thank you really for your very generous words.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Gunja. Meanwhile, we have a long comment again from Satvir, and then hopefully, not hopefully really, because we would, much as we would like for it to go on, we do realize, Professor Isabel, it is the beginning of your day. For us, it's nearing the end of the day. You know, it's about 3:30 p.m. in India. I think you have a whole day ahead of you, so we won't take much of your time after Satvir Singh's comment, wherein he says that, thank you indeed for an insightful lecture. It sent me into deep thought about the motif of metamorphosis in literature. In fact, that was exactly the cover page that was on my mind when I thought, if there's nothing else, I'll bring that in. So thank you, Satvir, for this. The works from the Mahabharata to Shakespeare to Kafka to Golding and so on connect metamorphosis of humans to the lowest possible beings, is a kind of fall from grace in the periods of extreme brutality. Thanks again. So I think some deep thought there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I can just say, I think it's a really interesting thing about the shifting fortunes of the insect, because as you say quite correctly here, it's a sort of demotion. But increasingly, there's this idea of the sort of intelligence of the swarm, and that so much, in fact, computing is based on a sort of almost like an insect kind of mentality. So it's a really interesting thing. And I suppose, I mean, the way that insects have been portrayed and thought about has changed enormously over time. But I think they sort of kind of their reputation with the digital world and computing has sort of gone up a bit, I think.
Absolutely, ma'am. I think the flip side, the downside, and also the, looking at, the fall really, and, the whole idea of who's looking up, who's looking down, and all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small takes a whole new spin, because you do realize that the smallest of the small perhaps does go a big way. Thank you, Satvir, for that. Pretty profound in terms of what you are trying to both ask and suggest. I don't think there's anything else. Dr. Sangamitra, Ms. Nishtha, am I missing out on anyone? A raised hand or a comment? A comment between two comments, because sometimes you scroll down and you realize that you've forgotten to read someone's. I hope I've not missed out on any.
No, ma'am.
Okay. All right, then, Professor Hoffmeyer, thank you very much. We come to the end of today's event. I thank late Professor Jain's family and friends, his students, colleagues, all my colleagues and everyone else here, of course, beginning with you who has made it all possible. Even though virtually we have drawn the strength and motivation to keep doing our utmost for the highest and to keep this up, of course, to stay in touch with you and maybe have you over in person going forward. Let's see, as in when you are in India, close to our state, even in Delhi, just let us know and we'll do our best to have you over. I'm also very thankful to our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. Ashok Gupta, to Professor T.N. Mathur, the Honorable Vice Chancellor, and to Dr. Rakhi Gupta, the Registrar, for their support and encouragement throughout. My thanks go, of course, to all my colleagues for so very well ensuring the smooth conduct of today's event. As you can see, I think but for one technological challenge for which none of us can be blamed, it has gone on very, very seamlessly and smoothly. Their concerted efforts have led to today's program being conducted so very well. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to all in the audience. Maybe we can have a customary picture with everybody turning on their camera. I mean, just for old time's sake, as we would do, during the COVID years. Let's just have a picture. And of course, we've clicked a lot of pictures sneakily, Professor Hoffmeyer. There were screenshots, I think, that were clicked sneakily just as a memory and to serve as a reminder of the lovely time that we've had, so academically enriching. So if I may request everyone to please turn on their camera, and would further request tech support to maybe get some screenshots. Thank you, Ranu, Harshita, Kumkum for joining in, Shoa, all of you. See, up till now, you were all blips on the screen, and now it's so lovely. I'm sure Professor Isabel Hoffmeyer feels a bit more heard and responded to. It's always great for the speaker to look at faces, not mere names. And who else? Renuka is here as well. Rati ma'am, would you? There, Mrityunjay, there. I think the ones who asked questions and put comments in the chat box should definitely turn their camera on, for the sake of authenticity and establishing their credentials. So there, Renuka is on the move, but then she has turned it on for a couple of seconds. Have we got our pictures, sir? Okay, the tech support says that we've got our pictures. Thank you very much, Professor Isabel Hoffmeyer. It's been an absolute pleasure. I must appreciate in front of everyone that, without losing a single minute, your email replies come to me at lightning speed. And it's so encouraging, when a senior academician such as yourself is replying in the affirmative for every single time, for every single request of yours. So deeply, deeply appreciative and humbled. And I'm sure our late dean would have loved to see this in person, but you know what, for a memorial, you don't have to be around for the memorial to take place. So such is life. But thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you everyone in the audience. And we're very close to the biggest festival, the Christmas in India. The Indian Christmas is drawing close. We're very close to Diwali. So I wish everybody, and Isabel, from all of us here to you, a very, very happy Diwali. And I think it's a great way to also close the year in the next 2 months. And we'll keep this up. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.